Welcome to the press conference of Canada, Germany, and United Kingdom on Climate Finance Delivery Plan Progress Report ahead of COP27. Bienvenue à cette conférence de presse du Canada, de l'Allemagne et du Royaume-Uni sur le rapport d'étape du plan de mise en œuvre du financement de la lutte contre les changements climatiques à l'approche de la COP27. We are now ready to begin. Nous sommes maintenant prêts à débuter. I will now pass the floor to Alok Sharma, President of the 26th United Nations Climate Change Conference. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much indeed, Angela, and thank you everyone for joining this event. Last year, ahead of COP26, we set out a climate finance delivery plan meeting the US dollar 100 billion goal. And that report was prepared by our friends in Canada and in Germany, specifically Minister Wilkinson in the Canadian government and Minister Flashbart in the German government led that report. And we felt it was very important that we set out the trajectory on the $100 billion and what was going to happen going forward year by year. So if I can just remind you of some of the key outcomes of that particular report from last year, was that we expect the $100 billion to be met in 2023 and over the 5-year period 2020 to 2025 in excess of $500 billion in total to be deployed. And at COP26 itself as well, we got a commitment from developed countries to double adaptation finance by 2025 on 2019 levels. And it was really important that ahead of this COP27, we had an update, a progress report, and that is what, of course, has now been published and that we're here to discuss. And I want to place on record my very grateful thanks to Minister Guilbeault, to State Secretary Morgan, and indeed to all their teams who have worked incredibly hard in pulling together this really informative report. I also want to thank the UK team for their input as well. Now, just turning briefly to the report, because my colleagues will obviously take you through the detail of it, but I think what the report does demonstrate is that developed countries remain committed to the trajectory on the $100 billion and beyond that was set out in last year's delivery plan. So we do remain on track for delivery in 2023. And this report also makes clear that we are making important progress in response to the call for enhanced transparency and predictability on climate finance. The report also shows progress on adaptation finance, and this is on the basis of independent numbers which are verified by the OECD. But of course, it does very much remain the case that developed countries and indeed the whole of the global financial system need to be doing even more and faster to support developing nations. And that's why, very importantly, this report also sets out further information on the 10 collective actions that were outlined in last year's delivery report. And I think what it also says, and I think we're hearing these increasingly loud and powerful calls for MDB reform, and that really is about putting climate at the heart of absolutely everything we do in finance. So in terms of next steps, obviously, it's critical that we do keep to the trajectory and we deliver on the $100 billion, that we do continue the process on ramping up adaptation finance, which is so vitally important. And of course, we also improve access to finance as well, which is so important for very many countries. And ultimately, this is all about rebuilding and retaining trust in the system. I'm now going to pass over to my friends, State Secretary Morgan and Minister Guilbeault, to take you through the details of the report. So first, Jennifer, if I may pass back to you.
Thanks so much, Alok, COP President Alok Sharma, and thank you for the opportunity for us to be able to dive into this very important topic. I think before going into the details of the report, and I'll hand it over to Minister Guilbeault to do that, I wanted to just speak briefly on the context in which we were developing it. I think it was clear when we started, there were two things that were clear, that number one, the need for climate finance was immense and growing. And number two, we are collectively under-delivering on our commitment to provide the 100 billion by 2020 and have made the commitment to deliver by next year. And of course, we've all seen the context of the intense, extreme, hard and fast, and also just in the last days, seeing the long way we have to go in having global emissions in order to keep 1.5, that limit within sight. Within also a geopolitical context where things have become more challenging, whether it be really driven very much by the Russian war of aggression, but also the longstanding effects of the pandemic, climate impacts, and they've all exacerbated food and energy insecurity and indebtedness across the globe. So that is the context in which we have undertaken this work. And I think in the face of all of that, by the end of the process, two further things were clear. Number one is we have made important progress towards our goal of delivering the 100 billion per year. And number two, the 100 billion is a drop in the ocean in the challenge that we have of our international climate and development finance systems that are going to need to tackle in the coming years. And that's why the report brings together a number of ongoing conversations with two goals in mind. Number one, to build trust and transparency on how the climate finance commitments will be delivered, but also to showcase shared priorities and highlight the action being taken to reform the broader system. And because this report aimed to build trust and transparency, it was important to Minister Guilbeault and to I to ensure that engagement was a central part of the process. So we undertook an inclusive and collaborative approach. We asked developed countries and multilateral development banks to share examples of their actions this year. And we did outreach to developing countries via the UNFCCC group chairs to hear their challenges to accessing and implementing climate finance, what works, what needs improvement, and how the report can meaningfully increase transparency. We also held two roundtables with civil society to learn from experts and practitioners and share information on the report and process for delivering it back in July and then just last week. So we're happy today for the first time to speak about the details, and I will turn it over to Minister Guilbeault. Stephen, over to you to introduce those.
Merci beaucoup, secrétaire d'État Morgan. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Je me joins à vous d'Ottawa, sur le territoire traditionnel des Algonquins et Anishinabés. Et je suis heureux d'avoir l'occasion de parler de l'orientation du rapport d'étape sur le financement du climat. The consultations described by State Secretary Morgan were a key part of the process. They help inform the four key areas that form the focus of the report. The first two priorities are to increase adaptation finance and to improve the effectiveness of mobilizing private finance. And the last two priorities are to work with multilateral development banks to increase and improve climate finance, as well as address barriers in accessing climate finance. In each of these areas, the progress report highlights were developed with what developed countries agreed to and where we think we need to go next. Il y a 4 points principaux à retenir pour étendre et accroître l'impact du financement climatique dans les pays en voie de développement. Nous avons besoin que les contributeurs s'engagent à doubler le financement de l'adaptation de manière transparente et prévisible. Nous devons réduire les obstacles bureaucratiques afin de faciliter l'accès des candidats au financement des projets. Nous devons mieux mobiliser les financements privés et nous avons besoin que tous les pays travaillent ensemble pour assurer que les banques multilatérales de développement placent le climat au premier plan de leur travail et augmentent leurs ambitions. I would like to focus your attention on the first two priorities, starting with adaptation finance. At COP26, developed countries were encouraged to raise their collective ambition, adaptation financing to developing countries, at the very least double their 2019 levels by the year 2025. This goal was a key outcome of the Glasgow Climate Pact. For adaptation financing, there were two key considerations that we worked to address in the progress report: transparency and clarity. We heard that an important step toward achieving transparency would be to gather together all the adaptation finance targets that have been made so far, to increase transparency on these pledges being made. We surveyed all contributors and included a table in the progress report outlining the adaptation finance commitments from developed countries and multilateral development banks. This would increase our shared understanding of what doubling means in this context. We also clarified in the report that the doubling would be from $20 billion in 2019 to $40 billion in 2025, based on methodology from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. We also heard calls for a roadmap on the doubling of climate finance targets. However, after speaking with a wide range of contributors, we determined that there are some important reasons for not having a year-by-year roadmap. Some contributors would like to work hand in hand with their recipient partners to determine the best way to allocate adaptation finance. Some need more time to work through the details of their targets with their government or their shareholders. Given it's been only 1 year since the Glasgow Climate Pact, providing clear information on commitments, as we have done in the progress report, is a significant step toward greater transparency and predictability. We believe this meaningful contribution to doubling will drive conversations moving forward. Le Canada reste fermement engagé à donner l'exemple. Notre financement de l'adaptation au changement climatique a soutenu des projets tels que renforcer la résilience des communautés face au changement climatique au Sénégal. La contribution de 2 milliards de dollars du Canada aide à soutenir la sécurité alimentaire au Sénégal en augmentant l'agriculture intelligente face au climat et le rôle des femmes dans la prise de décision pour des moyens de subsistance durables. Nous sommes également fiers de travailler à la mise en œuvre de notre initiative Partenariat pour le climat, dotée d'une enveloppe de 315 millions de dollars. Cette initiative financera des projets de la société civile, des peuples autochtones et d'autres organisations au Canada pour soutenir l'adaptation au changement climatique en Afrique subsaharienne et dans d'autres régions du monde. The second priority I would like to touch on is mobilizing private finance. We know that this is a critical part of the $100 billion goal, as public finance alone cannot meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. But mobilizing private finance has been challenging. It made up only $13.1 billion of the total $83.3 billion mobilized in 2020. We had expected that number to be significantly higher by now, and we need it to be higher in order to meet the magnitude of the climate challenge that we face. We still lack the data to get a full understanding of the challenges and opportunities that remain for mobilizing private finance. This data is critical to our discussions on the new collective quantified goal. As a result, Canada and Germany, alongside several other countries, have agreed to commission a lessons learned study on private finance mobilized. The study will increase our understanding. It may also inform our discussions towards a new post-2025 climate finance goal. I will now turn back to State Secretary Morgan to speak about the two other priority areas.
Thanks so much. So on the issue of the multilateral development banks, it's clear that they are a main source of investment in climate-friendly infrastructure and resilience for many developing countries. They accounted for over $30 billion of the $83.3 billion mobilized in 2020. And they are also set up to be key mobilizers of private finance for climate. And so it's clear they have a crucial role to play in meeting this $100 billion goal, as well as the doubling of adaptation finance. And that's why it's important to see that most developed countries have really stepped up their efforts to push for greater climate ambition within the MDBs this year. Concretely, countries including major shareholders, including those here on this call, have gotten behind these calls for increased ambition. We're asking MDBs to scale up their adaptation finance, drastically simplify and accelerate the processes for accessing finance, and be open to take greater risk if it enables countries to build resilience and greener economies. And the report also showcases the efforts behind these calls. It also shows that banks have made some progress in responding to those calls, including on adaptation finance, where several MDBs have set up dedicated adaptation programming for the first time. And indeed, if you look between MDP reports of 2020 and 2021, you'll see that there are two additional trends. One is grant shares are on the rise, particularly for adaptation finance, from 12.5% in 2020 to 15% in 2021. And adaptation finance is shifting towards the most vulnerable, which is just essential. So in 2021, 39% of adaptation finance went to sub-Saharan Africa, up from 35%, but not at the expense of other vulnerable countries, since the share to South Asia and to Latin America and the Caribbean remain the same, which is about 17%. But this is not a place to rest on laurels, but it is showing some progress, which is important. MDBs, as we all know, sit at the heart of the international development finance system, and therefore they are key to a more systematic and effective approach to climate finance. And I think one of the things that has become very clear in the consultations for this report is that climate change is increasingly recognized as a fundamental risk to development. And so I think we're seeing signs of the progress with MDB scaling up their overall share of climate finance, including the World Bank, but an even greater climate finance portion is absolutely necessary. And equally important, the financing of fossil fuel investments has to end. And beyond this, I think many contributors recognize the need for a fundamental reform of the business model, particularly of the World Bank. And that's why at the recent World Bank annual meeting, a group of countries, including those here, actually voiced unprecedented calls for reform, making it clear that we expect the World Bank to better address global challenges, including climate. And this appetite for reform, I think, is reflected not just in this report, but in other initiatives like the Bridgetown Agenda. Our development finance system needs to better tackle global public bads, from climate change to biodiversity loss to the pandemic. And I think as this report highlights, developed countries will continue to work together and with developing countries to ensure MDBs increase their ambition across the board. The other topic that we heard really over and over again is the one of access. And access to finance sounds like a very dry issue. But at the end of the day, it decides whether money is reaching those in need, whether a country can actually build the wind farm that helps them deliver on their national climate commitments, or adapt their economies, their sectors, their food production to the onslaught of climate impacts. So access to finance, it makes or breaks climate action, which is why this came through as a priority area pretty much in all of our conversations with developing countries, but also with finance providers. And therefore, it's probably not surprising that many of the initiatives already underway, which are reported on in the report, working on improving access to climate finance, such as the Task Force on Access and the work of the NDC Partnership and many more. However, access to finance is a systemic issue, and it needs a systemic solution. It's about understanding how to navigate the bureaucratic hurdles of over a dozen finance institutions, which sounds tricky, and it is. And that's why it needs a concerted effort, and why, as part of our work on the progress report, we chose to commission a study to further understand the gaps and barriers in tackling access to inform the recommendations for further action. The study confirmed the 4 C's, or identified 4 C's: capacity, coordination, coherence, and communication. And recommendations for further action on these 4 C's are identified in the report, and we will continue to push on these to improve the different dimensions on access. This includes looking into how best to further strengthen the capacities in the field, and working further with MDBs and climate funds to move the needle on increasing harmonization application procedures and reducing barriers to access. So I think, in my conclusion, closing that gap to deliver the 100 billion is critical to deliver as soon as possible. The commitment stands to do that next year. We know that this is a matter of trust. And I just want to thank you all for your contributions and insights to the report and joining here today, and want to give the floor back to Minister Guilbeault.
Merci, secrétaire d'État Morgan. Je tiens également à vous remercier, ainsi que le président Alok Sharma, d'être parmi nous aujourd'hui. La secrétaire d'État Morgan et moi-même restons déterminés à fournir le financement pour le climat et à faire en sorte que les fonds aillent là où ils sont le plus nécessaires pour s'attaquer aux causes et conséquences des changements climatiques. We hope that this report is another step toward building trust by demonstrating all contributors' dedication to the $100 billion climate finance goal and to transparency in achieving that goal. I look forward to continuing the conversation at COP27 next month and beyond. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Merci, Ministre Guilbeault. Thank you, Minister Guilbeault. This now ends the live stream on Facebook. Ceci finit la présentation sur Facebook. We will now be taking questions from media. Please use the hand-raising function if you have a question. We ask that you keep to one question and one follow-up. We kindly ask that you ensure your line is muted if not asking questions, but unmuted if you are. The following commands can be entered via DTMF tones using your phone's dial pad. *6, toggle mute, unmute, *9 to raise your hand. Veuillez utiliser la fonction main levée si vous avez une question. Nous vous demandons de vous en tenir à une question et une question de suivi. Nous vous prions de vérifier que vous êtes en mode muet lorsque vous ne posez pas de questions et que vous avez rétabli le son lorsque vous avez des questions. Les combinaisons de touches suivantes peuvent être utilisées sur votre clavier de numérotation. Étoile 6, couper, rétablir le son. Étoile 9, lever la main. Our first question is from David Thurton. Please state your name and media outlet before asking your question. Notre première question est de la part de David Thurton. Veuillez indiquer votre nom et le média que vous représentez avant de poser votre question. Please go ahead. Allez-y.
Hey, David Thurton, CBC. Thanks for doing the work and sharing this report. I'm just wondering, though, having read it, why don't you name names about, and tell us who's not doing the work, who's not pulling the weight to get to that 100 billion US? That would have been really helpful. But anyways, thanks for doing the work with the report. It's a good report.
Not sure there was a question in there, David, but I mean, Jennifer spoke about the role of the MDBs. I spoke about how do we ensure that we mobilize private sector financing. I think maybe your question was about countries themselves.
Exactly.
You can look at what countries are doing in terms of contribution. The information is there.
But I mean, how come we don't see a particular country? How come you're not saying that, okay, this country X, you can do some more, or you're not doing enough? I mean, I think that's something I guess I would like to see in the report, but but anyways, that's your response. I do note that you do call out the World Bank in particular as an international development bank that isn't doing, it seems like, not pulling their weight. And so I guess my question is, I'm just wondering, if you could speak a bit more to that. Do their current plans or the pace of their plans recognize the change that is needed to address the challenge that we have of climate change?
Jennifer, do you want to give it a go, and I'll go after you?
Sure. I mean, I also just wanted to clarify also, this is a report that's owned by all donors, just so that's clear. We have our forward of the two of us, but actually the bulk of the report is owned by everyone. And I'm happy to start on MDBs, but I'm sure that both of you could come in on this. I mean, I think that there's clearly a number of different areas of where the bank can step up more in the amount that it's funding around climate itself, really integrating it into everything that it does. Looking also at its own vision, looking at more on policy-based lending, incorporating the risks in more. I think those are some of the key pieces there. I think there's other things around how much the bank is ready to use its own AAA rating as well in order to and to increase its risk appetite. Let me stop there and hand it over to Stephen and Alok.
Alok, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, look, I just want to make the point that in terms of the World Bank, obviously this report does recognize the amount of money that has gone in this year or last year from the World Bank, almost 32 billion into climate. Obviously, we need to be doing more. And I think what is also very important, and I'm speaking not specifically about this report, but the MDBs, of course, made a pledge in 2021 in terms of where they would be by 2025 in terms of climate finance and lending. And that goal was met 4 years early. So one of the things that we've certainly all been individually asking and collectively asking the MDBs to do is to set out a collective update on their 2025 pledge at COP27. And I hope that is something that will be forthcoming. There's a wider point here, though, which is that you've seen and Jennifer sort of obviously made reference to the Bridgetown agenda and some of the other voices that we've been hearing in terms of deeper reform on the international financial architecture. And I have to say, I think we really need to look collectively very seriously at this issue. And I've said this before, but I repeat that I think the world is now ripe for a Bretton Woods II moment where we come together as a set of nations and we ensure that we enshrine climate and climate action at the center of all of these international financial institutions.
Thank you. And if I may add, I think one thing we've heard very loud and clear is that as the largest of them all, the World Bank has an especially important role to play. And some multilateral development banks are being more proactive than others, but I think there is a clear desire to see the World Bank be one of the most ambitious, and it's not out there. And all the banks need to urgently fully align their operations and portfolio with the goals of the Paris Agreement, and we're not seeing that yet. And one could argue that even before talking about reforms of these institutions, donor countries like ours need to ensure that all of these institutions understand that climate should be their number one priority. And right now, I'm not sure that we as donor country have given that message. I think lately, maybe, but it hasn't been the case necessarily over the last few years. And I think many of the banks have too many priorities. And if you have too many priorities, you have no priorities. And I think we need to make it clear that climate needs to be one of those top priorities for all of these institutions.
Thank you. Next question. Prochaine question. Jean-Thomas Léveillé, La Presse. À vous la parole.
Bonjour, M. Guilbeault. Est-ce que j'ai bien compris que on a amassé en 2021 et probablement en 2022 davantage qu'en 2020, mais que l'objectif de 100 milliards n'est toujours pas atteint et accessoirement, quand est-ce que vous pensez l'atteindre?
Merci pour la question. Effectivement, et on savait l'an passé, dans le premier rapport, que nous n'atteindrons pas la cible du 100 milliards avant 2023, mais comme le disait Alok un peu plus tôt dans son introduction, en moyenne de 2020 à 2025, nous allons dépasser le 500 milliards de dollars. Donc, nous ne l'atteindrons pas avant 2023, mais en 2023, 2024, 2025, nous allons dépasser le 100 milliards, de sorte que sur une moyenne de 5 ans, entre 2020 et 2025, nous allons atteindre 100 milliards de dollars par année.
Très bien, je vous remercie beaucoup.
Question de suivi, Jean-Thomas?
C'était essentiellement ma seule question, merci.
Merci. Next, Mia Rapson. Mia Rapson, go ahead.
Yeah, good morning. Further to David's questions about, I think he was kind of getting whether we should be naming and shaming the countries that aren't doing enough, but I don't see a very clear layout in this report about what has been committed, where it's gone, and where that gap actually is. If someone can maybe walk us through what we actually raised in 2022, what we're looking at raising in 2023, and where those gaps are, that would be very helpful.
So I can maybe speak to the approach. I think that was really the work of last year's report. I think this year's report was more focused on the 10 action points and of that delivery plan, and to see what kind of progress had been made or not. And so that's not very much of a quantitative, except for the adaptation table, and also quantifying that doubling goal from 20 to 40, which we hope will help. So on adaptation finance, I think that's where you see greater transparency and greater clarity, as Minister Guilbeault was saying. And that is what we heard was a great priority for developing countries. But you see more really the digging into what's happened, and since Glasgow occurred and since that report was published. We didn't want to just publish a report last year and then put it on the shelf. We think it's very important to say, okay, this is what we said needed to happen. So let's go back and see, okay, what happened here and what didn't happen here. And then I think what we work to do is to pull out the 4 areas that we saw actually were the priorities of developing countries, also of the developed countries, I think, that have listened to kind of those priorities. And then said, okay, where can we go from here? Where do we need more information? And so you've heard that on a couple of items like private finance. I think we just have to dig in there because it's not delivering yet. So what more do we need to be doing there? And then also on the access piece, where there's quite a lot that's happened, but there's some additional commitments there. So that's the approach. And that's why you don't see us walking through all of the details of all the numbers for this year, except for more transparency on adaptation.
I agree with everything Jennifer said.
Okay, but if we're trying to explain to people where we're getting to, is it not helpful to explain to them where we're actually at financially? I mean, you were saying we're on track, but there's nothing in this report that actually shows that we're on track. So I'm just curious how we can explain to people or show to people that we are on track if those numbers are still a year old, and there's a lot of numbers in here that have been committed in the last year. So surely we're ahead of where we were a year ago.
I think Stephen might be frozen. I mean, I think that's what you find in the OECD report. So the OECD report. Go ahead, Stephen.
We're happy to send it to you. That's what I was about to say, Jennifer.
Yeah, sorry.
A reminder to please state your name and media outlet before asking your question. Un rappel de veuillez indiquer votre nom et le média que vous représentez avant de poser votre question. Next, Ella Nielsen. Prochaine, Ella Nielsen.
Hi, all. Excuse me, Ella Nielsen with CNN. Thanks all for holding this call today. I just wanted to reiterate what the last speaker had said and ask if you guys could please send that figure just so that we know what the figure is for this year and sort of how far there is to go. That would be great. My other question that I had was, you all mentioned the need, basically that this 100 billion goal that's been out there for years now is short of what is really needed to tackle the scale of climate change. And so, and that there will sort of be a reassessment of that goal post 2025. And I just wanted to ask on the issues of trust that, Jennifer, you mentioned and other folks mentioned as well. I mean, how are you all sort of planning to communicate to developing nations that, if this $100 billion goal still has not been met, I know that it's planned for 3 years after it was initially said, but how can you communicate to developing countries that an even larger goal can be laid out and met if this one has not been yet? Thank you.
Perhaps I can take a first shot, and you might want to add. So as Alok said in his introduction, we know that on average, we will get to 100 billion per year in the 2020-2025 period. Number one. Number two, we've never attempted anything on that scale internationally. Like it is unprecedented. And I think what this year's progress report shows is that we're making some progress in some areas, but there are still some challenges that remain. We talked about the multilateral institutions. We talked about private sector mobilization. And how can developing countries trust that we can mobilize more money post 2025? Well, by unlocking these elements. If you look at the report and the data provided by the OECD in terms of public financing, we're getting there, but it's these other two components that are missing. And we know that to get to where we need to go, both in terms of adaptation, mitigation, the number is much higher than $100 billion. But a lot of it will need to come from the private sector. A lot of it will need to come from multilateral institutions, and public money as well. So I think, but by unlocking these two important elements, we know we can get to more than 100 billion. And we spoke to all of the donor countries, and everyone reaffirmed their commitment to get to what will enable us to get to 100 billion in 2023. That was the case last year. It's still the case this year.
Follow-up? Question de suivi?
Yes, and just as a quick follow-up, what is the case that you all are making to private financial institutions, especially around adaptation finance? And can you give us a little bit more insight into why they are behind and so behind, and yeah, what the case is that you're making for them to really speed it up? Thank you.
Do you want to go ahead, Jennifer? No. So when we speak with those people in the private sector that are very interested in getting involved, there's a couple of things. So I think the role of governments and multilateral institutions is to de-risk investment in either technology or technological development or large-scale transformation in developing countries. And there's also, in some cases, political risk. There are countries where it is more difficult to do that, and private investors will be reluctant to be the first one to go or to be the first one to take the risks. And I think governments should be doing that, and I think the World Bank should be doing that. I think that this is our role to do that. So this is certainly, it's not the only element, but I think it's an important element that I know I've heard, and I'm sure as Jennifer and Alok have as well, but maybe you two want to add something to that.
I'll just quickly add something and then hand it over to Alok. I mean, I think that what we know and what we've said is that part of this question is around de-risking, so that there is more private investment that flows, and that MDBs and public finance is not yet good enough at that de-risking. I think the other thing that we know is, or are learning, is that the policy framework of the country in which we need more private sector investment is also absolutely essential. So we need long, loud legal signals, policies and measures around, for example, renewable energy that gives that clarity and that long-term signal so that private sector investment can flow. And I think that's part of the reason you're seeing as well. And that's the conversation that I think happens between, you asked about kind of the conversations we're having with those private sector players, that they actually are more engaging in those types of solutions, policies going in to countries moving forward. Also on adaptation. I mean, adaptation, I think we all know will require more public finance, but it's another area where I think in certain areas, it can come in. But over to you, Alok, on this.
Yeah, so Jennifer, look, I just want to reiterate what you and Stephen have said, is that, and I think the report also sort of makes clear that what we really need is to see more leverage of private finance coming in alongside the public money, and that frankly hasn't happened so far. And I think there are a number of reasons for that, but certainly one of them is this whole issue of de-risking that Jennifer talked about. And so, one very specific thing that I think the MDBs need to look at, very seriously is setting up first loss products to allow the private sector to then come in. And, reaching the $100 billion goal is absolutely totemic. We have to do that. And it is a matter of trust, as all of us have said on this call. But I think we also have to understand and realize that if you're going to make a meaningful difference in terms of climate action, if you're going to make a meaningful difference in terms of having clean energy deployed across the world, we are going to need trillions of dollars coming from the private sector. All the conversations that we have been having with the private sector, just to be clear, this is sort of outside the scope of this particular report, but the conversations that we have demonstrate to me that actually the private sector would like to come in, they would like to invest, and that frankly is behind the just energy transition partnerships that we've all been working on through the G7 and other developed countries. But if we are really going to have a sort of sea change in the way that climate finance overall flows, we're going to have a lot more money coming in from the private sector.
Thank you. La prochaine question, Chloé Farah. Veuillez indiquer votre nom et le média que vous représentez avant de poser votre question. Next question, Chloé Farah. Please state your name and media outlet before asking your question.
Thank you very much. So Chloe Ferrand from Climate Home News in the UK. My question is, will the money from the JETPs be included in meeting the $100 billion goal? And I mean public and private money, so the public money as well as the mobilized money.
That's a good question. I think ultimately this comes down to OECD definitions and how money actually flows and how the private finance money is attached. So you may find some of it is relevant and some of it isn't. But I mean that comes down to the methodology of the OECD. And just going back to this earlier point that was raised about the figures, I think as both Jennifer and Stephen have said, the figures that are out there that are effectively audited in terms of what has happened, the latest figures are the 2020 figures from the OECD, which show that over £83 billion has been deployed in 2020. What we did in producing last year's report was, of course, for the OECD to go through the numbers to sort of verify the methodology. So it basically had the sort of the stamp of the OECD, certainly on the projected numbers. But on your specific point about the private finance that comes in alongside public money on the JETPs, that will depend on how it comes in and actually at what point it comes in.
Right, thank you. And
we also, if I may add, we also want to make sure that there's no double counting happening. So if a country has already contributed money as part of its climate finance commitment, and then some of that money goes to JETP, then you can't count it twice, which is why the work of the OECD is so important to make those determinations.
Follow-up, Chloe?
Thank you. Yeah, and just a follow-up, if I may. On the adaptation finance, the table is helpful, sort of listing the commitments. I'm just wondering whether you've got a ballpark figure of how much that's kind of bridged the gap towards doubling, because we've got this long list of commitments, but how do we say, how far have we come since the pledge last year to double adaptation finance? Do you have a sort of estimate, either as a percentage or give us a sense of progress made in the last 12 months? Thank you.
I think I asked the same question to myself, and I think we need to do more work on that. I think in order to be able to compare and make sure that we're not double counting things and make sure that it's really new and additional, I think the first step was to provide the transparency and the clarity around what each country, what each institution is doing on that, and and also to kind of differentiate it between, from development finance, because many countries and donors actually include it in their central development finance. So that's why you don't see a nice number at the bottom of the chart yet.
But I think the fact that in the progress report this year, we're setting the baseline in 2019, 20 billion. So we know where we started from. So we'll be able to compare progress based on the establishment of that baseline.
Thank you. Next question, Sarah Schonhart. Prochaine question, Sarah Schonhart. Please state your name and media outlet. S'il vous plaît, indiquez votre nom et le média que vous représentez. Over to you.
Hi, thanks. This is Sarah Schoenhart from E&E News. Thank you for doing this. There was a question last year about reaching the target in 2023 and the fact that that would be 3 years of shortfall on the 100 billion. And so I think there were questions about how that would be made up in the end in order to deliver the 100 billion over the entire period of the commitment. And I still am uncertain of whether that will be reached. And so wondered if you could provide clarity on whether once the target is reached, there will be an attempt to also make up for the years of shortfall.
Alok, you did an excellent job in talking about this initially. Do you want to do it again?
Well, I was just looking at last year's report, just so I could give you a sort of the full information. The key thing I think from last year, which I've said and which Stephen sort of repeated again, is that over the 5-year period from 2020 to 2025, we will be in excess of 500 billion. And the whole point of last year's report was that it was, effectively a forward-looking document in terms of what was going to come forward. And as we've just acknowledged, the figure wasn't met in 2020. The key thing now, first, is to make sure that we deliver on the 100 billion in 2023, and then look to see that actually the commitments that have been made for subsequent years are actually adhered to, and hopefully may even be exceeded.
I think we even expect to overshoot in the years to come. I think there's a number of these different levers that we're working on that we can overshoot.
Follow up, Sarah? Question de suivi?
Yeah, if I may just quickly, I am curious what you've learned in the process of putting these delivery plans together in terms of target setting. I mean, this goes back to a question one of the journalists asked earlier about future goals and future target setting. The 100 billion, as you've noted, Secretary Sharma, has become totemic. And so what maybe have you learned about future financing arrangements and in target setting so that it's more reflective of needs and not just something kind of pulled from thin air?
If you go back to how the commitment was made in Copenhagen, I think we can all agree that the amount of clarity wasn't necessarily what was needed. And we're still suffering from that today in many ways. Like what are we talking about? Public sector, private sector, MDBs. So the work that the UK, Germany, and Canada have been doing over the last 2 years to clarify these things through the report last year and the progress report this year is work that should have been done at the very beginning. Like we should have agreed on that from the get-go. And if I can make a parallel to the COP15 CBD COP coming to Montreal, the UK recently, in collaboration with, I believe it's Colombia and Costa Rica, Alok, I'm not sure, produced a very interesting report on mobilizing finance for biodiversity conservation. And the thinking there is, instead of starting to talk about a number, let's look at what the needs are, what the mechanisms are, what the sources of funding are, and then we can start talking about how much money we need. But as opposed to, we kind of, with the $100 billion commitment from Copenhagen, we kind of did it reversely, and I don't think it's a very good way of doing it.
Yeah, I can also share a few thoughts. I think it's something that one reason why we're doing this report is to learn, because as you know, we are starting to, we're already discussing what happens after 2025. And we also hope that this COP, that we can get an agenda item that would be broader, which would look at all financial flows, as Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement says, that they should all be aligned with 1.5. So I think we need to learn from this process. I think we've learned that, I would say finding, looking at the different goals, clearly the actually outcomes that you're trying to achieve, and what are the different instruments that are there that can help achieve those goals much more in a much more tailored way. I think we've learned that climate finance is not just numbers. I think in this report, really looking at the access issues, looking at some of those issues is fundamental. And so spending more time on that, looking at the quality of the finance, I think is also quite important, and also the enabling environments that are there for those funds. And I think we also have learned that we likely need new instruments. There is a very important discussion happening on debt for climate right now. And that is, showing how we have to keep up with the times and adapt and be much more agile on that. And lastly, I think involving the finance community, the ministers, the IMF, yes, also the private sector is quite important. And that, if you want to go even broader, I would say, yes, we need to be looking at the finance for these things, but we also need to look at the fact of how costly the impacts themselves are right now, and also have that in the back of our minds. But there's lots of lessons of how we can do this better in the future.
Thank you. This now concludes today's event. Merci. Ceci conclut la rencontre d'aujourd'hui. If you have follow-up questions, you can reach out to Media Relations at Environment Canada, media@ec.gc.ca. Si vous avez des questions de suivi, vous pouvez faire affaire avec les relations avec les médias à Environnement Canada, media@ec.gc.ca. Thank you for participating. Merci de votre participation.
Thank you very much, everyone. Merci beaucoup tout le monde.
Thank you.
Recording stopped.